Eli Dawson hadn't slept through the night in 2 years. Not since Clara died. Not since the fever took her in 4 days and left him standing in the doorway of their bedroom, holding a cup of broth she'd never drink, and 2 children asleep in the next room who didn't know yet that their mother was gone. He'd stood there for a long time, long enough for the broth to go cold, long enough for the candle to burn down to a stub, long enough for the first light of morning to come through the window and make the room look the same as it always looked, except it wasn't the same, and it never would be again. He'd set the cup on the dresser and walked out and done the chores and fed the children and buried his wife under the oak tree behind the cabin and kept going because that's what men do when the world falls out from under them. They keep going. Not because they're strong, because stopping isn't an option when 2 small people need breakfast. He was 34 years old and he looked 45. 2 years of sleeping in pieces, an hour here, 2 hours there, waking at every small sound because his body had learned during Clara's illness that sleep was dangerous and bad things happened while you weren't watching. Had carved him down to something lean and hollow. His eyes had the particular tiredness of a man who isn't just physically exhausted, but existentially so. Tired of waking up. Tired of the chores. Tired of cooking meals he doesn't taste and washing clothes he doesn't notice, and doing the same things every day in a house that used to have a voice in it besides his own, and now doesn't. He had a dark beard he trimmed when he remembered, and hair that needed cutting, and hands that were rough and capable, and never still because keeping his hands moving was the only way he knew to keep his mind from going to the places it went when his hands stopped. The children were the reason he got up. Annabelle was 6, and she had Clara's red hair, and Clara's habit of talking to animals like they understood her. And sometimes Eli would catch a glimpse of her from a certain angle, and his chest would lock up, because for 1/2 second he'd see Clara, and then he'd blink, and it was just his daughter, and the grief would come fresh every time, like a wound that reopens whenever you move the wrong way. Samuel was 4, and he didn't remember his mother at all, which was its own kind of tragedy. Not the presence of loss, but the absence of it. A boy who would grow up without the thing he was missing because he'd never had it long enough to know he'd lost it. Eli told him about Clara. Every night. He told both of them about their mother the way you tell a story you're afraid of forgetting. With detail, with repetition, with the desperate precision of a man trying to keep someone alive through words, because words were all he had left. The homestead was 10 miles outside of Copper Hill, Montana, on a piece of land Eli's father had claimed. 30 head of cattle, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden, a cabin with 2 rooms. It still worked, barely. Eli did the labor of 2 people every day, and it was enough to keep the cattle fed and the children clothed, but not enough to keep the garden weeded, or the cabin clean, or the mending done, or any of the 100 things Clara had handled that he'd never noticed until she wasn't there. That's the thing about losing someone who held a household together. You don't realize they were the structure until it collapses. The woman appeared on a Tuesday. He didn't see her arrive. He went to bed at 11 after carrying Samuel to his bed and checking on Annabelle, who was curled up with the barn cat she'd smuggled inside again. He lay down on his bed, the bed he'd shared with Clara, the bed he now slept on the far edge of, as if leaving room for someone who wasn't coming back. And when he woke at 5 in the morning and looked out the window, he saw someone in the chicken coop. His first thought was a thief. His second thought was that no thief works this quietly or this carefully. His third thought was not a thought at all, but a feeling. The feeling of seeing something so unexpected that your brain stalls and your body takes over. And his body walked him to the door and out onto the porch and across the yard to the chicken pen fence. And his hand found the gate latch and stopped there, because what he was seeing didn't make sense, and he needed a moment to catch up. A woman was kneeling in the dirt inside the pen. Young, maybe 27 or 28. Dark hair, loose and messy, falling past her shoulders like she'd slept on it wrong and hadn't bothered to fix it. She was wearing a simple cotton dress that was wrinkled and dusty, and her feet were bare, and she was scattering grain from the tin pail, his tin pail, from his feed shed, with one hand, while the other hand rested gently on a hen that had settled into her lap as if it belonged there. She was talking to the chickens, not in the performative way that people talk to animals when they know someone's watching, but in the private, unconscious way of a person who's done this 1,000 mornings and doesn't think about it anymore. Low murmuring, soft clucking sounds that the chickens responded to by clustering around her knees, like she was the center of their world. She looked settled. She looked like she'd been doing this for years. She looked like she belonged there. Eli stood at the gate with his hand on the latch and watched her, and something happened inside his chest that he wasn't prepared for. It wasn't sudden. It was more like a crack in a dam, small at first, barely noticeable, and then wider and wider until the thing behind it couldn't be held back anymore. He watched her hands in the grain, and he watched the hen in her lap, and he watched the way her hair fell across her face when she leaned forward, and the way she pushed it back with the inside of her wrist because her fingers were covered in feed dust, and he watched the ease of her, the naturalness, the way she existed in this space as if the space had been waiting for her, and he felt something he thought had died with Clara 2 years ago. Not desire, not loneliness, something quieter than both. The feeling of seeing a person in the exact right place at the exact right time and knowing, not hoping, not guessing, knowing, that your life just changed, and the changing happened before you could decide whether to let it. She hadn't turned around. She didn't know he was there, and he was already gone. By the way, if this story is already pulling at you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling us what country you're listening from. We love hearing where our listeners are. Now let's continue. He opened the gate. The hinge creaked. She turned. She didn't scream. She didn't jump. She looked at him with the expression of a person who'd been expecting to get caught and had made peace with it before it happened. Her eyes were brown and tired, and there was something in them that Eli recognized immediately. The same look he saw in his own reflection in the water trough every morning. The look of someone running on the fumes of whatever's left after everything else has burned away. "I'm sorry," she said. She didn't stand up. The hen was still in her lap, and she seemed unwilling to disturb it. "I know this is your place. I saw the coop last night and the chickens hadn't been fed and She stopped. She looked at the grain in her hand. "I used to keep chickens. Before. It felt nice to do it again." "Who are you?" Eli said. His voice was rough from sleep and from not talking to an adult in longer than he could remember. "My name is Josephine, Joe. I've been walking for 3 days. I saw your cabin from the road last night and I slept in the barn." She paused. "I wasn't going to steal anything. I just needed a roof." "Where are you coming from?" "Billings. Before that, St. Paul. Before that." She stopped, and the stopping said more than the places. The stopping said there were too many befores, and none of them had worked out, and she was tired of listing them. "Where are you going?" She looked at the chickens around her knees. She looked at the pail in her hand. She looked at the cabin behind him where a lamp had just come on in the window, which meant Annabelle was awake, which meant Samuel would be awake in minutes, and the morning would begin its familiar chaos of small needs and cereal bowls and lost shoes. She looked at all of it, and she said, "I don't know. Somewhere that needs me." Eli looked at her. He looked at the fed chickens. He looked at the cabin where his daughter was now standing in the window watching them. He said, "The chickens seem to think you're needed here." She almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles moved, but the smile didn't fully arrive. Like it had been out of practice for so long it had forgotten how to complete itself. "I should go," she said. She lifted the hen off her lap and set it down gently, and stood up and brushed the dirt from her dress. And she was shorter than he'd thought, barely reaching his shoulder, and thin in the way that means skipped meals and long walking and not enough of anything for too long. "Have you eaten?" he said. "I'm fine. That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning was coming on now, the sky turning from gray to pale gold, and in the new light he could see her more clearly. The dark circles under her eyes, the sunburn on her nose, the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way her hands were rough and competent and had clearly known hard work. She was not pretty in the way that word is usually meant. She was something better. She was real. She looked like a person who'd been through things and was still standing. And the still standing part was the most beautiful thing about her. "No," she said. "I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." "Come inside," he said. She came inside. Annabelle was at the table in her nightgown with her hair in the same red tangle it was in every morning. And she looked at Josephine and said, "Are you the chicken lady?" Because Annabelle had been watching from the window and had already constructed an entire identity for this stranger based on the only information she had. Josephine looked at Annabelle and something happened to her face. A softening, a cracking, the particular tenderness that some women carry for children they've never met, because the tenderness isn't about the specific child, but about children in general and what they represent. which is the possibility that the world isn't as hard as it seems. I suppose I am, Josephine said. Samuel wandered out, rubbing his eyes, and saw Josephine and walked straight to her and raised his arms, which was what Samuel did with everyone, because Samuel had not yet learned that the world doesn't always pick you up when you ask. And Josephine looked at Eli, and Eli nodded, and she picked Samuel up and put him on her hip, and the boy put his head on her shoulder and closed his eyes and went back to sleep. And Josephine stood in the kitchen, holding a stranger's child like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Eli turned to the stove because his eyes were doing something he didn't want her to see. He made breakfast, eggs and biscuits and coffee. She ate the way hungry people eat when they're trying not to show how hungry they are. Controlled, paced, one bite at a time. The discipline of someone who's been hungry enough times to know that eating too fast makes you sick. She ate 3 biscuits and 2 eggs and drank 2 cups of coffee, and the color came back to her face in stages like a lamp being turned up slowly. She told him her story while Annabelle played with the cat, and Samuel slept on a blanket by the stove. She'd been married for 2 years to a man in St. Paul who drank and gambled and lost their house, and then their savings, and then himself inside a bottle. One morning she woke up and he was gone, and so was the last of the money, and she was alone with nothing but a note that said, "I'm sorry," which is the cheapest thing a man can leave behind because it costs nothing to write and changes nothing for the person reading it. She'd gone to Billings to find work and found some, until the boarding house closed and the work dried up, and she'd started walking, because walking was free, and standing still felt like giving up. Eli told her about Clara. He told her the way he told the children, with detail, with care, with the need to make Clara real for someone who'd never known her. He told Josephine about Clara's red hair and her laugh, and the way she sang hymns while she weeded the garden, and the way she could calm a spooked horse with just her voice, and the way she died in 4 days, and the way the house had been quiet ever since. And the quiet was the thing that was killing him, not the work, not the tiredness, but the quiet. "I understand quiet," Josephine said. "I've been in quiet so long I forgot what noise sounds like." She stayed that day. She washed the dishes without being asked. She swept the cabin without being asked. She mended a hole in Samuel's shirt that Eli had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. She reorganized the pantry, which had devolved into chaos because Eli put things wherever his hand happened to be and never remembered where that was. She did all of it with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knew how to run a household and hadn't had one to run in too long. And the doing of it seemed to feed something in her the same way breakfast had fed her body. She moved faster, stood straighter. Her eyes got brighter as the day went on, as if usefulness was its own kind of nourishment. Annabelle followed her everywhere. This was unusual because Annabelle was cautious with strangers, a trait she'd developed after her mother died, when the parade of churchwomen had come offering help, and then stopped coming when the help became inconvenient. Annabelle had learned that people leave, and she'd responded by not getting attached, but she followed Josephine. She sat beside her while she mended. She showed her the barn cat and the secret spot behind the woodpile where the wildflowers grew first in spring. She gave Josephine the full tour of her world, which is what a child does when they've decided someone is safe, and watching it happen made Eli's chest tight in a way that was painful and good at the same time. At the end of the day, Josephine said, "I should go. I've taken enough of your time." "Where will you go?" She didn't answer. The same silence she'd given him that morning. The silence of a woman who doesn't have a destination and knows it. "Stay tonight," Eli said. "Barn's warm enough. I'll set up a bedroll." "You've already done too much. You fed my chickens and cleaned my house and mended my son's shirt, and my daughter hasn't smiled like that in 2 years. I think we're even." She stayed. She slept in the barn, and Eli lay in his bed and listened to the quiet, and the quiet was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It had a shape to it. The shape of a woman in his barn, and the possibility that she'd still be there in the morning, and the fear that she wouldn't be. She was there, 5 a.m., in the chicken coop, feeding them, talking to them, the hen in her lap. The same scene as the morning before, and Eli stood at the gate and watched her, and this time she heard him coming and turned around and said, "You're late." He laughed. The sound came out of him like something that had been locked in a room for 2 years and had just found the door open. A real laugh, short and surprised and rusty from disuse. And Josephine looked at him, and this time the smile arrived, all the way, full and real, and it changed her entire face from tired to luminous. And Eli held onto the fence because his knees did something he didn't expect. She stayed that day, and the next, and the next. The days stopped being days and started being a life. She cooked, she cleaned, she managed the garden that had gone wild, and within 2 weeks it was producing again. Rows of vegetables that stood straight and orderly like soldiers called to attention. She was good at growing things. She had the hands for it, patient and firm and gentle in the way that growing things require, knowing when to tend and when to leave alone, and when to pull something out by the root because it was taking more than it was giving. Eli worked the cattle and the fences and the heavy labor, and he came home in the evenings to a cabin that smelled like food and sounded like voices, and the shock of it didn't wear off. Every evening he walked through the door and heard Annabelle laughing or Samuel babbling or Josephine humming while she stirred a pot, and the sound hit him fresh like a wave. He'd forgotten what a home sounded like. He'd been living in a house for 2 years, and the difference between a house and a home is the sound of someone humming at the stove. They didn't talk about what this was. She slept in the barn, he slept in the cabin. They sat on the porch in the evenings after the children were asleep and talked in low, comfortable voices. She told him about growing up in Ohio on a dairy farm and milking cows before she could read. He told her about Clara's singing and how the cabin still felt like it was waiting for her to start again. She didn't flinch when he talked about Clara. She didn't compete with a ghost. She just listened, and once she said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." And the simplicity of it made Eli trust her in a way no other words could have. Annabelle was the one who forced the conversation. Children always are. She walked up to Eli one evening when Josephine was putting Samuel to bed in the cabin, and she looked at her father with Clara's green eyes and said, "Is Joe going to stay forever?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I want her to stay forever." "I know. Do you want her to stay forever?" Eli looked at his daughter, his 6-year-old daughter who'd lost her mother and learned not to attach, and had attached anyway because Josephine had made it safe to attach again. And the question his daughter was asking was the question he'd been asking himself for weeks and hadn't had the courage to answer. "Yes," he said, "I do." "Then tell her, Papa. People leave when you don't tell them to stay." He found Josephine on the porch that night after the children were asleep. She was sitting in Clara's chair, the rocking chair Eli had built for Clara when she was pregnant with Annabelle, and she was looking at the mountains and the stars, and her feet were tucked under her, and she looked like she'd been sitting in that chair her whole life. "Joe," he said, "Eli, my daughter wants to know if you're staying forever." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I'd ask you." Josephine rocked the chair once, twice. She looked at the mountains. She said, "I showed up at your place with nothing. No money, no shoes, no plan. I fed your chickens because I didn't know what else to do with myself. And you let me in." She paused. "Nobody's let me in before. Not really. Is that a yes?" She looked at him. She stood up from the chair. She walked to where he was leaning against the porch post, and she stood close enough that he could smell the soap she'd used to wash the children's clothes, and the wood smoke from the stove, and something underneath all of it that was just her. She put her hand on his chest over his heart, and she said, "I've been yours since the first morning you didn't ask me to leave." He kissed her, gently, the way a man kisses a woman when he's out of practice and terrified and certain all at the same time. She kissed him back, with her hand still on his chest, and his heart was hammering under her palm, and she could feel it. And he didn't care, because hiding was over. Hiding had been over since the morning he'd found her in the chicken coop, talking to hens with a lap full of feathers and bare feet in the dirt, and the whole world had tilted sideways and rearranged itself around a woman he hadn't known existed 12 hours before. They married in the fall, small ceremony, the Reverend from Copper Hill, the children, and Mrs. Hernandez from the next ranch over, who cried through the whole thing and said afterward that it was about time. Josephine wore a blue dress she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd bought with egg money, because the chickens were producing twice what they had before she'd arrived, which Eli said was because she talked to them, and Josephine said was because she fed them properly. And they were both right. 3 years later, the homestead had grown. More cattle, a bigger garden, a new room on the cabin for the baby, a girl they'd named Clara because Josephine had suggested it, and the suggesting told Eli everything he needed to know about the kind of woman he'd married. She wasn't replacing Clara. She was continuing her. Every morning at 5 a.m., Josephine was in the chicken coop. Every morning, Eli stood at the gate and watched her for a moment before she noticed him. It had become their ritual. Her in the dirt with the grain and the hens, him at the fence with his coffee. The world quiet and golden and new. And every morning she'd look up and say, "You're late." And every morning he'd smile, and the smile was the realest thing about him, because it came from the place where grief and gratitude had learned to share a room. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that love doesn't always arrive with a knock on the door, sometimes it just shows up barefoot at 5 a.m. doing something kind when it thinks nobody's watching. Then subscribe and join us for the next one. Leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from. And remember, the best people aren't the ones who ask to be let in. They're the ones who start helping before you even know they're there.